Most children leave amusement parks with stuffed animals and cotton candy, but for 6-year-old Matteo, it ends with panic, silence, and a man in a black SUV whose presence freezes time. Julia Harper, a volunteer paramedic, only wanted to help a lost boy near the haunted tunnel. But what she finds is something far more dangerous. The boy fears the wrong security badge. The man claiming to be his father wears power like a second skin. And between them, Julia is pulled into a world where trust is currency, and love is the only thing worth risking everything for. Stay with us. This isn't just about a child who was lost. It's about what it means to be found. Julia Harper's shift at Liberty Park had officially ended 25 minutes ago, but she lingered out of habit, finishing a log sheet, helping a kid who scraped his knee on the bumper cars, and then walking the long way out past the older rides. It was near the Phantom Tunnel, the dilapidated haunted ride that always felt colder than the rest of the park, where she noticed movement near a staff-only gate. A shape, too small to be an adult, was huddled against the wall just past the emergency exit. Her first thought was that it was a lost toddler, maybe hiding from overzealous parents, but as she got closer, she saw a boy around 6, crouched low, with his back pressed to the metal siding, one shoe missing, and a sticky smear of cotton candy on his jaw. He wasn't crying. That was the first red flag. Lost kids always cried. He just looked up at her, frozen but alert, like he'd already weighed the pros and cons of running. "Hey," she said softly, kneeling so she wasn't towering over him. "You okay? Are you lost?" His eyes darted past her toward a pair of security guards chatting by the ticket booths. "I can't let them see me," he whispered. "Tio Luke said they're not the right ones." Julia blinked. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at the boy, trying to read him, not just his words, but how he said them. His voice was flat, controlled, no panic, no drama, just a tiny, matter-of-fact person relaying orders like a junior soldier following mission protocol. "Who's Tio Luke?" she asked carefully. The boy didn't move. "He brought me here, said to wait. He said if they find me, they'll call the wrong people." The wrong people, not bad guys, not kidnappers, the wrong people. Julia frowned. "What's your name, sweetheart?" The boy hesitated. "Matteo," he said finally, voice low, eyes still watching the guards. Julia swallowed. She reached a hand toward him, palm up. "Okay, Matteo. My name's Julia. I work here. I won't take you to them, but let's get somewhere safe, all right? Maybe the first aid room, just so you can sit, have some water, and we'll figure this out together." For the first time, Matteo moved. He stood, slowly, stiffly, and slipped his hand into hers. His fingers were ice cold. The quiet trust in that moment hit her harder than any scream would have. They made it 20 steps before the world shifted. Julia felt it in her chest before she understood it in her brain. The change in rhythm, in pressure, in tension around them. 3 men appeared at the far end of the walkway. Not uniformed staff, not park-goers, suits, expensive ones, no badges. No IDs. They didn't approach fast or shout demands. They simply existed in the path, watching. Julia tightened her grip on Matteo's hand. He pressed into her side, his fingers trembling now. "Do you know them?" she asked quietly. "No," he breathed. "They're not Tio Luke." And then, as if the situation had not already screamed something is wrong, a black SUV rolled through the restricted access gate without being stopped. The guards didn't even look up. It parked with deliberate calm just ahead of the men, and for a moment, everything went still. Matteo buried his face against Julia's side. "Don't let go of me," he whispered. Julia didn't. Her eyes were fixed on the SUV as the back door opened, and out stepped the kind of man you're not supposed to make eye contact with unless you're invited. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. The silence that followed his arrival wasn't awkward. It was controlled, engineered. He was tall, sharply dressed, his features carved like decisions made too young. He looked at her, then at Matteo, and then slowly walked forward until they were just a few feet apart. Giulia's instincts flared. Every nerve told her to move, but the boy beside her clung tighter, not looser. That confused her. "You're Enrico Vidal," she said before she could stop herself. His brow lifted slightly, almost impressed. "Yes," he replied. Then, after a pause, his voice softened, cultured and cold. "That's my son." Giulia blinked again, stunned. "He was alone," she said, "scared. He said someone named Tio Luke left him here." Matteo peeked up but didn't speak. Enrico studied her, then knelt, not to grab the boy, but just to level his eyes with his. "You're safe now," he said, but Matteo didn't move. He stayed pressed against Giulia. Enrico stood slowly and turned to her. "Thank you," he said, voice neutral, but eyes locked on hers like he was trying to calculate who she was and what it meant that his son had chosen her. Truly. The SUV door remained open. Matteo still hadn't let go of Giulia's hand. Neither had she asked him to. "He didn't want to be seen by your men," she said carefully. "Or the park security. Said they wore the wrong badges. That doesn't sound like a typical lost child scenario, does it?" Enrico didn't answer immediately. His expression barely changed, but the pause said everything. He was reading her now, assessing risk, leverage, intent. Finally, he said, "May I speak with you privately, just for a moment?" Giulia hesitated, but nodded. He led her a few steps away, within earshot of his men, but far enough that Matteo couldn't hear. "I need someone who is not from my world to stay near him. Someone he trusts. Someone who doesn't come with history. He responded to you. That matters." She opened her mouth to protest, to say she wasn't qualified, that she was just a part-time paramedic and med student with student debt, and no business being anywhere near this world. But he cut her off with a single look. "This isn't a request. Not really. But it is an offer. For both of you." Giulia stared at him, then at Matteo, who was still standing exactly where she left him, small and silent, clinging to the only thing familiar, her. "This feels like a very polite kidnapping," she muttered. Enrico almost smiled. Almost. "You can call it what you like," he said. "But he chose you. And that is rare." Giulia exhaled slowly. Her whole life had been built on logic and caution, on keeping distance. But that boy hadn't just held her hand, he'd held her still, and whatever this was, it wasn't going to let her walk away clean. She turned back to Matteo. "Come on, kiddo," she said, voice gentler than she expected. He came immediately, still holding tight. As they walked toward the open SUV, she glanced at Enrico. He said nothing more. Just watched them both, then followed. But it wasn't the silence or the strange offer that lingered in Giulia's mind. It was the way he'd said thank you, not like a man grateful, but like a man recognizing the exact moment someone crossed a line they could never uncross. The SUV drove for nearly an hour without a single word spoken between them. Giulia sat stiffly, her arm cradling Matteo, who had leaned into her the moment they left the park and hadn't moved since. His head was tucked under her chin, and his tiny hand still clutched the fabric of her jacket, his knuckles white from tension even in sleep. Every time the vehicle turned or slowed, she expected him to wake, to ask where they were going. But he didn't. That disturbed her more than if he had. Enrico sat across from them, not watching the road, but watching her. Not with suspicion, but with analysis, as if every breath she took was telling him something. When the SUV finally pulled up to tall iron gates and they opened without so much as a buzz, she felt the full weight of how out of place she was, and yet she didn't loosen her hold on the child. Even as the estate came into view, sprawling, angular, guarded, even as the reality that she was in a criminal's car sunk into her bones, she didn't let him go. Because the moment she did, she feared he'd fold into himself again. And for some reason, She couldn't let that happen. Inside the house, Julia wasn't given a tour. There were no polite welcomes, no staff introductions, no forced smiles. Instead, Enrico led her down a hallway with deliberate pace, Matteo still in her arms, and gestured toward a set of wide double doors. "This is the family wing," he said simply. "No one comes here unless I say so." She wasn't sure whether that was meant to reassure her or warn her. They entered a sitting room with oversized windows and a velvet couch so pristine she hesitated to sit. She did anyway. Matteo nestled against her shoulder. Enrico stood in front of the unlit fireplace, hands in his pockets, his silence more commanding than any monologue. "He's been through more than he understands," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "And he doesn't trust easily. Tonight, he reached for you. That's rare." "I don't ignore things like that." Julia's mouth was dry. "He needs a therapist, not a stranger with a first aid license." Enrico's eyes met hers, unwavering. "He needs someone who doesn't work for me, who doesn't answer to anyone in this house. Someone who doesn't owe me loyalty, and that makes you valuable." Julia shook her head, but softly. "You're talking about hiring me." "I'm offering you a role that matters," he corrected. "To him and to me." Julia wanted to say no. She wanted to get up, hand Matteo to whatever shadowy nanny existed in this place, and walk out with her life intact. But the moment her body shifted, even slightly, Matteo stirred in her lap and whimpered, not words, just a small broken sound that sounded far too practiced. His hand fumbled for hers again, even in sleep. She sat back down. "He's terrified," she murmured. Enrico's gaze didn't waver. "He's lived through things children shouldn't even be able to name." That line hit harder than she expected. Julia glanced down at the boy's face, his lashes resting on cheeks smudged with dried sugar and dirt. "What exactly would this role involve?" she asked finally. "Staying close. Helping him speak again, helping him sleep without waking up in a sweat, helping him forget." Enrico said it with a kind of resignation, as though he already knew some of those things wouldn't happen. Julia rubbed a thumb gently across Matteo's arm, trying to untangle her own thoughts. This wasn't what she'd planned, none of it was, and yet something inside her wasn't screaming for the exit. Instead, it was leaning in, quietly, uneasily, but undeniably. She asked questions, real ones. Where was the mother? "Gone," Enrico said without elaboration. "Why was Matteo at the park without a legal guardian?" Enrico deflected. "Where was Tio Luke now?" "Handled," he replied flatly, and Julia didn't push further. It was like trying to pour water into a sealed glass. No entry, no give. But the thing was, she didn't need all the answers. Not now. What she needed was to understand the boy in her arms, the one who hadn't let go of her since the moment he found her in the dark. "Why me?" she asked, and Enrico didn't flinch. "Because he chose you," he said, "and because you didn't ask who I was when you saw me. You looked at him." That made her blink. She hadn't realized it, but he was right. The fear she felt in the park hadn't been of Enrico. It had been for the boy. "I'm not a professional caregiver," she said again, more to herself now. "I'm a third-year med student who works part-time." "Then you understand trauma," Enrico said, "and how wounds aren't always visible." Julia nodded slowly, absorbing that. The truth was, she did. Maybe more than he guessed. The hours blurred. At some point, a staff member brought her a glass of water and a meal she hadn't asked for. She barely touched either. Matteo slept deeply now, arms slack around her waist, breathing even. Enrico remained nearby, always in view, but never invasive. He didn't hover. He watched. And that was somehow worse. "You don't have to decide now," he said eventually. "But if you leave, he'll ask for you. And if he asks for you, I'll have to lie. I don't like lying to him." Julia exhaled. "I'm not sure I'm the one you think I am." Enrico tilted his head slightly. He already decided that. I'm just following his lead. She wanted to argue, to stand up and say she couldn't be part of this. But the weight of the boy against her, the stillness in his small body that finally looked like rest, not exhaustion, kept her anchored. The thought of him waking up and finding her gone made her stomach turn. She glanced down again. He looked safe, safer than she'd seen him since the moment he was found. And that, she realized, was what scared her most. She didn't speak again for a long time, not until Matteo stirred and shifted his face closer to her chest, letting out a small, contented sigh. Enrico took a step forward, but didn't interrupt. "He's warm with you," he said softly. "He hasn't been warm with anyone in a long time." Julia swallowed hard, eyes locked on the boy's profile. Every part of her wanted to stand, to distance herself from whatever this was becoming. But she didn't. "Fine," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now, I'll stay." It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a decision she was sure of, but it was real. Enrico didn't smile. He simply nodded once, as if that was all he needed. And Julia leaned back, her hand resting lightly on Matteo's back, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. The house still felt like a prison. The men outside still had guns. The questions still screamed in her mind, but something in that boy had tethered her, gently, completely, irreversibly. And as the quiet settled in around them, she finally understood. This wasn't a job offer. It was a turning point. And she had already stepped past the line. The first few days in the Vidal mansion unfolded like a series of muted scenes, void of noise, color, or warmth. Julia woke early and went to sleep late, her internal clock resisting the rhythm of this new reality. Matteo barely spoke. He followed her at a distance, never too far, but rarely close enough to touch unless invited. Mealtimes were the quietest moments of all, the clink of silverware, the only punctuation. Enrico wasn't always present, but when he was, his attention would drift to Matteo and hover, lingering without words. Julia tried small gestures to coax the boy out, silly questions, light commentary, games he didn't engage with. None of it worked. Then one afternoon, she found him sitting cross-legged on the floor of the sunroom, with a stack of blank printer paper and a handful of colored pencils. He didn't ask for them. Someone must have left them for him. He was drawing furiously, as if the act itself were keeping him upright. Julia sat across from him and waited. He didn't look up. She only saw the drawings later, when he left them in a neat pile on the couch. Stick figures, one small, one tall. Always apart, always with space between them. Julia didn't need a degree in child psychology to know what the drawings meant. The smaller figure was always smiling, even if crudely. The taller one never had a face at all. It wasn't hard to decipher who was who. She took a deep breath and slid the stack into a drawer without comment. He had left them to be found, not discussed. Every night she tucked him into bed in the same sterile, oversized room he hadn't decorated. He never asked for stories, but he didn't protest when she sat beside him and read aloud anyway. He didn't ask for light, but she always left the lamp on low. One evening she stayed past the last page of the book and just sat in silence until his breathing evened. She rose to leave, but he opened his eyes and asked, "Are you going far?" It was barely audible. "No," she replied, "just my room." He nodded, eyes falling closed again. That small question haunted her long after she'd crossed the hallway. It wasn't about physical distance, it was about trust. He wanted to know if she'd vanish, the way someone else had, the way his mother or Tio Luke, or maybe even his father had. On the fourth night, Julia was awakened by a soft shuffle outside her door. At first, she thought it was one of the guards, the ones who passed every hour like clockwork. But then she heard the smallest knock, 3 quiet taps. She opened the door slowly, and there he was, Matteo, curled into himself like a question mark, holding a stuffed toy that had lost one eye and most of its stuffing. He didn't say anything. She crouched. "Matteo." He looked up. "I had the bad dream again," he murmured. "I didn't want to wake the people." She didn't ask who the people were. Instead, she reached for him, and he stepped forward without hesitation. She carried him, barefoot and half asleep, back to his room. But the bed felt cold and distant, too large, too impersonal. So she sat in the armchair near the window, cradling him like he was much younger than 6. His head rested on her shoulder, his fingers absently curling into her shirt. No more words were spoken, just breathing. Eventually, he fell asleep again. She didn't move, couldn't. Not when she realized it was the first time he'd come looking for comfort instead of flinching away from it. What Julia hadn't noticed was the faint shift in shadow near the hallway. Enrico had been walking past, not listening, just moving through his own house like a ghost. When he heard the knock, something in the cadence stopped him. Not fear, something softer. He lingered just outside the frame of the hall, just enough to see Julia cradle his son without hesitation. She hadn't called for help, hadn't knocked on doors, hadn't asked permission. She had simply done what was needed. His breath caught. Not because it surprised him, but because of how little it did. He watched for a few more moments. The way Matteo's small hand remained tangled in her shirt, the way Julia held him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then he left quietly, unnoticed. For the rest of the night he didn't sleep. He sat in his study, staring at a picture of Matteo when he was younger, smiling wider, eyes brighter, before things had turned, before the men with suits, before the headlines. It wasn't just that Matteo had found safety in Julia. It was the fact that Enrico had nothing to do with it, and perhaps never could. The following morning, Julia found Matteo already in the sunroom, the same stack of drawings now fanned across the glass table. But today, something had changed. The newest drawing showed the same 2 stick figures, small and tall, but this time they stood closer. The space between them was smaller, and the taller one had a face, not detailed, but there, a mouth, a pair of eyes, no longer blank. Julia sat beside him without a word. Matteo didn't explain. He didn't need to. She gently smoothed a wrinkle in the paper and left it there. Later, as she walked down the hall toward the kitchen, Enrico appeared at the top of the stairs. He didn't say anything right away, just watched her the way he always did, as if trying to gauge what she'd taken and what she'd given. Then, almost reluctantly, he spoke. "Thank you," he said softly. Sincerely, no calculated pause, no performance, just a man saying what he needed to say, even if it didn't fix anything. Julia looked up. His face was unreadable, but his voice wasn't. And in that small crack in his armor, she saw it, a man trying to be a father, and quietly, helplessly failing. And for the first time, she didn't see Enrico Vidal, the name whispered in courts and reports, the ghost with blood under his fingernails. She saw a man, a father who watched from the shadows as someone else consoled his son because he didn't know how. She didn't answer his thank you. She didn't need to. Instead, she nodded once and continued down the stairs. Behind her, she could still feel his gaze, heavier than before, but somehow less guarded. The mansion was still quiet. The security still moved like shadows, but in that one corner, for that one moment, something had shifted. Julia hadn't fixed anything. She hadn't saved anyone, but she had shown up and been chosen, and Enrico had seen it. He had felt it. The distance between the stick figures was shrinking, and for the first time, perhaps, it wasn't only Matteo who had someone to reach for. Julia had seen it in his eyes, not power, not command, but ache. Quiet, relentless human ache. Julia was brushing the knots out of Matteo's hair when he said it, quiet, like he didn't mean for the words to come out. Tio Luke used to yell when nobody else was around. Her hand froze mid-stroke, and she met his eyes in the mirror. He wasn't crying. He wasn't even looking at her. Just watching himself, eyes tired and distant, like he'd said something too heavy for someone his size. "What do you mean, Matteo?" she asked carefully, not wanting to push too hard. He shrugged, but it wasn't casual. It was protective, like his shoulders were trying to hide something inside him. He said, "I made too much noise sometimes, but I didn't. Not always." Julia knelt in front of him, setting the brush aside. "Did he hurt you?" Another shrug. Another wall. She waited. Matteo slowly reached for his shoe, pulled it off, then peeled back the insole. Inside, crumpled and damp, was a small piece of paper folded in four. He handed it to her without looking. Julia unfolded it. The ink was smudged, written in a child's uneven print. "If he finds out, they'll make you leave." Her throat tightened. Matteo. Who wrote this? But he'd already turned away, curling into the blanket on the couch, done talking. It took Julia half an hour to gather the courage to go find Enrico. She didn't knock softly. She pushed open the door to his study and held the note out like an accusation. "Do you know what this is?" He looked up from his laptop, gaze calm at first, but it flickered for half a second when he saw the paper. Not surprise, recognition. That flicker was enough. "Matteo said Tio Luke used to yell at him, hurt him. You let that man stay around your son?" Enrico closed the lid of his laptop slowly, like weighing every second before answering. "Luke was removed," he said finally, his voice flat. "Removed? That's the word you're going with?" Julia snapped. "You left a man who was hurting your child in the same house, and now you want me to pretend it's been handled just because you removed him?" Enrico stood, but didn't approach. Luke was a mistake. He was here for protection. He failed. He crossed a line. That line cost him everything. His tone was still controlled, but his jaw was tight. She saw it now, the edges of the man who didn't sit at press conferences, the version of him that didn't negotiate. "He didn't just fail you," she said, voice shaking. "He failed Matteo." Enrico stepped closer then, his hands at his sides, not clenched, but not open either. "You think I don't know that?" he said, and his voice finally cracked, not loudly, but like a small fissure running through something built too perfectly. "You think I sleep at night knowing I let someone like that near my son?" Julia didn't back down. "Then why wasn't he gone the second you saw something was wrong?" His eyes met hers with that same sharp focus he used when giving orders. "Because I didn't see it. Matteo doesn't cry. He doesn't scream. He doesn't complain. He hides." There was silence between them then, thick and hard to breathe through. "I didn't notice until it was too late, and when I did, I didn't just fire Luke. I buried him." Julia blinked. "You?" "Figuratively," Enrico said, though the pause before the word made her wonder. "You don't need to understand how I protect him. You just need to believe that I will never let him be hurt again." Julia's stomach twisted. She believed him, and that scared her more than the opposite would have. She stared at him for a long time, the note still trembling in her hand. "He trusted me with this," she said. "You get that? He didn't tell a bodyguard or a therapist or you. He told me. He wrote that because he was scared. And now I have to wonder if I'm next. If I speak too loudly, will I be removed too?" Enrico's face tightened again, but this time it was something raw beneath the surface. "I didn't bring you here to scare you," he said. "I brought you because I saw how he looked at you. He doesn't trust easily, neither do I. But if you think I'd hurt you for protecting him, then you don't know me at all." She looked at him again, and for the first time, truly saw the contradiction that was Enrico Vidal. Not the man from DEA briefings, not the myth. Just a father, furious at himself, desperate to do right, but wielding power like a knife because it was the only thing he knew. The moment passed like a storm cloud that had lost its thunder. Enrico walked back to his desk and sat down again. "You can keep the note," he said quietly. "He trusted you with it. I won't take that from you." Julia folded it, but didn't pocket it yet. She wanted him to see that it still mattered even now. "You say you protect him," she said. "Start by talking to him. Start by making sure he knows you see him. Really see him." Enrico didn't respond right away. Then finally, "I never should have trusted anyone else with what matters most." His voice had hardened again, but it wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at himself. Julia stepped back slowly, hands still around the folded paper, the weight of it somehow heavier than it looked. She didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar behind her. And for the first time, Julia no longer saw Enrico as simply the man in the tailored suit or the carefully spoken words. She had seen the wolf beneath it, the one that bared its teeth in silence, the one that punished betrayal with fire and steel. But she had also seen the terror that moved him, the gnawing fear of failing again, of trusting wrong again. She had seen a man building cages to protect what he loved, and not realizing the child inside might need a window, not bars. As she reached the hallway and looked back just once, the door still slightly open, she understood something terrifying and tender all at once. Monsters could hurt, yes, but sometimes they were just fathers who didn't know how to keep the light on. Julia didn't notice the change in Matteo at first. It was subtle, a slower blink when she entered the room, a pause before hiding behind his chair, the way he started sitting closer during reading time. Then one morning, while flipping through the worn copy of The Little Prince, he did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. It was a short, breathy thing, like he wasn't used to it, like it had to ask for permission before being heard. But it was there. She looked up sharply, and he was already trying to tuck it back in, shrinking into himself like he'd broken a rule. "It's okay to laugh," she said softly, and he looked at her, really looked, then pointed at the page. "He doesn't understand grown-ups," he said, tapping the illustration. Julia nodded. "Neither do I sometimes." That was the first time Matteo leaned into her arm voluntarily, his tiny shoulder pressing into hers like it belonged there. Later that day, he asked if she could teach him to write his name. She printed Mafia in block letters and watched him copy each one slowly, with concentration that made her heart ache. That night, his drawing had 3 stick figures, all the same height. From the second-floor balcony, Enrico watched everything. He never interrupted. He never crossed the invisible line he seemed to have drawn between himself and the living parts of his own home. But he was there, every day, eyes fixed on the boy and the woman pulling pieces of him back together. Julia felt his presence like a tension wire, stretched but never snapping. She didn't ask why he kept his distance, but the more Matteo opened up, the more she wondered what had built the wall between father and son. When Enrico finally asked to speak with her, no guards, no cameras, she was surprised not by the invitation, but by the hesitancy in his voice. 5 minutes, he said. That's all I'm asking. She nodded, even though her instincts told her this wasn't just about Matteo anymore. He led her through a side hallway she hadn't noticed before. No surveillance, no footsteps echoing behind them, just silence and a room with no ornate furniture, only a pair of chairs and a closed door behind them. When they sat, he didn't look at her right away. He folded his hands, looked at them like they might explain something he couldn't. "She was supposed to come with me," Enrico said quietly, but she said no, said she didn't want that kind of life. Julia didn't ask who. She didn't have to. The grief was already there in the way he said she, as if the name no longer mattered, only the absence. Matteo's mother died in a car crash. Not a hit, not a setup, just a stupid accident. She was on her way to meet me. I waited 40 minutes in the rain before I called her phone. A stranger answered. His voice didn't crack. That somehow made it worse. After that, he went on. "I didn't try again. I buried whatever was left of the man who might have earned a real family." Julia's throat tightened, not from pity but from the way he spoke, like he believed everything good was already behind him. "I don't tell you this for sympathy," he added. "I just want you to understand. If I'm too cold, if I'm too strict, it's because the last time I relaxed, I lost everything." Julia wanted to tell him that protecting something didn't mean building walls around it. But she didn't. She just sat there and listened. There was a moment after that, long, unscripted, real, where the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful, shared. Julia shifted in her chair slightly, watching his hands. One of them was trembling, just barely. She couldn't tell if it was fatigue, grief, or something else, but her body reacted before her mind did. She reached out and gently placed her fingers around his wrist, instinct more than intention. Enrico stiffened, just slightly, but he didn't pull away. His hand remained under hers, and for a few seconds, the pulse she felt wasn't just his. It was something shared, measured, human. "You still have something," she said finally. "Even if it's broken, it's not gone." He didn't respond with words. He just looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, not the calculated calm or the practiced charm. It was something rawer, less protected. "He draws you now," Julia added. 3 stick figures, together. Enrico looked away, not to avoid her, but to collect himself. When he looked back, he said only, "He's lucky to have you." She didn't correct him. They both knew who needed whom more. As she left the room, Julia felt something shift in the air, not the tension, but the distance. She wasn't sure if it was temporary or if something permanent had just cracked, but it felt like the first real bridge had been built between two people who spent their lives convincing themselves they were better off alone. Down the hall, she passed a guard who nodded without expression, but for the first time, she realized she didn't feel watched anymore. She felt seen. She returned to Matteo's room and found him asleep with a pencil still in his hand, a new drawing half finished beside him. 3 stick figures again, but this time they were holding hands. Julia smiled, ran her fingers over the page, then sat quietly beside his bed. She didn't wake him. She didn't need to. Whatever was broken in this house wasn't healed yet, but it had found a place to begin. A place where pain didn't have to stay pain forever. And out on the same balcony where he always stood, Enrico watched from a distance, but no longer as a ghost. He leaned on the rail, hands no longer shaking, eyes not quite as unreadable as before. Something had cracked inside him too, and though he wouldn't name it or show it, he allowed himself one moment of stillness. Just one. And in that stillness, the man who had buried every feeling after the death of Matteo's mother didn't feel like a criminal or a mistake. He felt, for a breath of time, like a father trying to do something right. For the first time, the space between them, Julia, Matteo, himself, didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like a room with the door left open, and maybe, just maybe, someone willing to walk through it. Julia didn't ask questions when Enrico told her to pack. His voice was low, tight with urgency, but not panic. "You'll take Matteo to the safe house in the mountains," he said, handing her a set of keys and a sealed envelope. "It's for security reasons. That's all you need to know." But Julia had learned to read between the words he didn't say. The weight in his gaze said more than the cold efficiency in his tone. She didn't argue, just nodded and carried Matteo to the car herself, buckling him in and whispering that they were going on a little adventure. The drive was long, the silence broken only by Matteo's soft humming in the back seat. When they arrived at the mountain property, a wooden and stone chalet surrounded by pines and silence, it felt both like an exile and a refuge. Julia didn't ask if they were being hunted or watched. She just unpacked Matteo's things, set up his books, and heated soup on the stove. Later, when she opened the envelope, it contained nothing but an emergency phone, a black credit card, and a note written in Enrico's hand. Keep him safe. Trust no one else. By the second day, something shifted. Matteo, who once spoke in half-sentences and shadows, began to speak more freely. He helped fold laundry, picked a favorite mug for hot chocolate, and asked her if it was okay to call her Jules. Julia blinked, caught off guard by how much the nickname warmed her more than the fire crackling behind them. "Of course," she said softly, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "But only if I get to call you Captain Matteo." That made him grin wide, missing tooth and all. The bond between them wasn't forced. It had grown out of silence, of shared routines, of trust built when no one was looking. When she taught him how to toast marshmallows over the gas flame, he called her the bravest grown-up because she didn't flinch when the marshmallow caught fire. That night, he curled up beside her on the couch, one small hand resting on her knee as they read The Little Prince for the 5th time. And Julia, in a moment of painful clarity, realized she would burn down cities to protect this boy. The quiet of the mountains didn't feel like a hiding place anymore. It felt like a pause the world owed them. When Enrico arrived on the 3rd night without warning, it was as if the storm had stepped inside. Julia was pouring tea in the kitchen when the front door creaked open, and there he was, not with the composed, commanding presence she'd grown used to, but with tired eyes, stiff shoulders, and clothes that smelled like airport terminals and unresolved decisions. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded at her, then looked around the cabin until his eyes landed on Matteo, asleep on the couch under Julia's cardigan. "He asked to wait up for you," Julia said quietly, pouring a second cup of tea before he could refuse. Didn't make it. Enrico sat at the table slowly, as if unsure whether he belonged in that kind of silence. She slid the cup toward him. "No wine tonight?" she asked, a faint smile playing at her lips. "Didn't feel like hiding behind it," he replied. It was the first honest thing he'd said in days. They sat there not as criminal and civilian, not as boss and employee, but simply two people who had run out of armor. He blew on the tea, then said almost to himself, "He called you Jules?" Julia nodded. "Asked for permission. I gave it." She saw the way his jaw flexed at that, a flash of something unspoken, as if the intimacy between them unsettled him more than any enemy ever could. She didn't press. Instead, she asked what had happened. What kind of threat made a man like him send away the only two people he trusted? But Enrico didn't answer. He just looked at her over the rim of the cup. His eyes weren't hard tonight. They were tired, searching, and full of something much heavier than secrets. "It won't always be like this," he murmured. "The running, the hiding, the silence." Julia tilted her head. "So what comes after?" That made him go still. The question, though simple, seemed to land like a weight on his chest. He lowered the cup and rested his hands on the table. But instead of an answer, he gave her a look, one that said he wished he had something to offer besides danger. A look that begged her to stay anyway, not because he deserved it, but because she already had one foot on the inside of the storm, and somehow she was still standing. They didn't speak again for a long time. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the old wall clock and the occasional creak of the wooden beams as the wind picked up outside. Julia stood and brought over a blanket, draping it over Enrico's shoulders without asking. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. She could feel the exhaustion vibrating off him like heat. "You should sleep," she said. "Even storms need rest." That made him let out something halfway between a sigh and a laugh. He rubbed his face, then looked at her with something startling in his eyes, gratitude. "If I ask you to stay," he said finally, "would you believe it's not a command?" Julia didn't answer. She just reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and this time he didn't flinch. When she pulled away, it was only to whisper, "He sleeps better when you're near." Enrico nodded once, stood slowly, and walked over to the couch. Matteo stirred in his sleep, but didn't wake. Enrico sat beside him, one hand gently brushing the boy's hair back. And Giulia watched them. The father, the son, the war between them paused for one night. She didn't sleep that night, neither did Enrico, but neither of them said it aloud. In the quiet of the mountain cabin, there was a kind of truth that required no declaration, only presence, only staying. When morning came, Giulia was the one who made breakfast. She didn't ask if they were going back soon. She didn't need to. There was something sacred about the pause, and she wasn't ready to give it back to the chaos of their usual life. As Matteo ran outside to chase the snow, Enrico lingered by the window, hands in his pockets, a tension in his stance that hadn't fully thawed, but didn't feel as sharp as before. "I trust you," he said finally, "more than I trust anyone." Giulia didn't turn to look at him. "Then don't make me regret it." He nodded once, not as a promise, but as a man who had stopped pretending he controlled everything. That night, after Matteo fell asleep again with his head on her lap, Enrico joined her in the kitchen. They shared tea again, no titles, no weapons, just silence. And when Giulia asked, "And after this?" he didn't have an answer, just a look and a silent request for her to stay. The fever started just after nightfall. At first, Giulia thought it was the altitude, maybe a reaction to the dry air or cabin dust. But by midnight, Matteo's skin was clammy and burning. His small frame trembled beneath the quilts, and his breaths came in short, shallow pulls that made her chest tighten with helplessness. She sat beside the bed with a wet cloth, whispering reassurances he likely couldn't hear. "I've got you, buddy," she said over and over, brushing his sweat-soaked curls back. He barely stirred. Isolated by the snowstorm, with no signal, no backup, and no hospital within reach, Giulia fell into motion as if she were back in the ER. Cold compresses, fluids in sips, monitoring every minute. But it wasn't the same. This wasn't just another patient. This was Matteo, the boy who'd asked to call her Jules, the boy who colored her into his family drawings. Every time he whimpered in his sleep, she felt it like a knife. The wind howled outside, and the storm showed no signs of breaking. At 3:12 a.m., just as she was changing the cloth on his forehead again, the door creaked open. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She felt Enrico's presence fill the room. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He just walked over and stood on the other side of the bed, looking down at the boy as if trying to will the fever away by sheer force of will. Giulia didn't move. She couldn't. Her hand was clenched tightly around Matteo's. The boy was murmuring in his sleep again, words jumbled in fevered dreams. Then, soft, broken, almost a sigh, came a single word that made both adults freeze. "Papai?" Enrico's posture shifted, not visibly, but profoundly. His hand, uncertain at first, reached forward and hovered before resting gently on Matteo's small fingers. Giulia saw the exact moment it landed, like a lifeline tossed to someone lost at sea. Matteo's fingers curled around his without opening his eyes, and something in Enrico broke in absolute silence. Giulia didn't say anything. She watched him hold his son's hand, truly hold it for the first time, and she understood that there were moments in life when language simply wasn't enough. This wasn't just father and son. This was a bond, finally acknowledged after months, maybe years, of pretending it could be postponed. The look on Enrico's face wasn't victory. It was grief, and something raw, love, laid bare without armor. The fever didn't break until morning, but the quiet that settled in the room was unlike anything Giulia had experienced before. She had seen men cry in hospital waiting rooms, had held mothers who screamed at doctors to save their children, had comforted teenagers whose fathers didn't show up for pickup. But this This was the sound of a man standing on the edge of a cliff he built himself and realizing there was no way back. When Matteo's body stopped shaking and his skin began to cool, Enrico exhaled, not relief, but release. He sat there, still holding Matteo's hand, unmoving. Giulia changed the cloth one last time, her hands quieter, gentler. She didn't look at Enrico, but she could feel the heat of his gaze when she tucked Matteo in. When she whispered, "You did good," not to the boy, but to the man beside him. Enrico didn't reply, not with words. He only gave her the smallest nod. It was more than gratitude. It was surrender. And in that surrender, she saw the beginning of something neither of them knew how to name yet. Not forgiveness, not love, but the willingness to stay in the room, even when it burned. Later that morning, after Matteo was resting peacefully, Giulia stepped out to the small living room and collapsed onto the couch, body aching with exhaustion. She hadn't cried during the night, not once. Not when the fever spiked, not when she'd felt truly afraid. But now, with the silence pressing in and no task to occupy her hands, the tears finally came. They weren't loud or messy, just silent proof that what had passed between them wasn't clinical, wasn't detached. When Enrico entered the room, he stopped in the doorway. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't need to. Instead, he crossed the space between them and sat beside her, both of them staring at the fireplace that neither had lit. After a long pause, he said it, not with drama, but with the weight of truth. He called his mother Mom on the second day. Giulia turned her head slowly. He didn't look at her. "I waited 2 years for him to say Dad. 2 years." He repeated, the words catching like they'd been carved in stone. "And it came when he didn't even know I was there." Giulia wanted to say something, anything, but no words felt adequate. She knew what that meant for him, what it cost to admit that out loud. He hadn't just lost a wife, he'd lost a role he didn't know how to fill. He'd waited, maybe without knowing it, for a child's voice to anchor him to something real. "It's not about time," she said finally. "It's about safety." He said it because he felt safe. Even in a fever, he reached for you. That made Enrico's jaw tighten, but he didn't look away. "Do you think that matters?" he asked. "After everything I've done?" Giulia shook her head. "You think love is clean. You think it waits for perfect timing." He stared at her then, really stared, and Giulia saw it, the fear beneath the steel. The man who had built empires but couldn't build a bridge to his own son. In that moment, she realized something terrifying and simple. She couldn't walk away. Not just because of Matteo, but because somewhere along the way, the storm she had entered had made room for her inside it. She stood and went to check on Matteo again, her feet knowing the way without thought. He was still sleeping, his breathing calm, his cheeks less red. Enrico stayed behind for a long moment before following her. When he leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed but not guarded, she met his gaze. "You were there when he needed you," she said quietly. "That counts." He didn't argue, didn't deflect, just nodded once and looked down at his son, the boy who had finally said the name he hadn't dared hope for. Giulia touched the edge of the bed, anchoring herself in the present, in this fragile peace. She didn't know what tomorrow held, if the storm would pass, or if it was only beginning. But what she knew was this. There was no unseeing the way Enrico had looked at his son, no unhearing the word Matteo had spoken in a fevered breath, and no unfeeling the way her own heart had shifted, like a compass reoriented without permission. She wasn't just passing through anymore. And as she stood beside them, man, boy, silence, she knew exactly what was at stake, and that she wasn't ready to let go of it. Back in the city, everything looked the same, but nothing felt like before. The danger had been neutralized. Enrico's men had done what needed to be done, whatever that meant in a world Giulia still only partially understood. There were no more late-night calls, no bulletproof vehicles idling at the end of the driveway, no encrypted conversations behind closed doors. But the house itself had changed. It wasn't just a mansion anymore. It had become something slower, quieter, not quite a home, not yet, but closer than it had ever dared to be. Matteo was the one who transformed first. He ran down the halls instead of tiptoeing. He laughed out loud, unafraid to be heard. He called her Jules with confidence, and for the first time he wrote out his full name in big block letters, showing it to her like a medal. Matteo Vidal. But he'd added something else in smaller print beneath it. Angel Jules, followed by a drawing of her with wings. "Because you don't get scared of the monsters," he'd said. Julia hadn't corrected him. She couldn't, because somehow this 6-year-old had seen the one truth she couldn't say out loud. She had been just as scared as he was, and she'd stayed anyway. Enrico called her to the office that afternoon. She expected something formal, maybe a conversation about routines, or the upcoming school enrollment paperwork, or the guard schedule. But when she entered, he was alone. No guards by the door. No assistant. Just him, seated behind his desk, with an envelope in front of him and a pen laid across it. He didn't stand. He just looked up and nodded for her to sit. "This isn't a contract," he said quietly, tapping the envelope. "At least not the kind you're expecting." Julia hesitated, but sat across from him, her heart suddenly racing in a way she hadn't felt in weeks. He slid the envelope toward her. "It's a custody petition, shared guardianship, legally binding." She didn't move, didn't touch it. "He needs more than what I am," Enrico continued, his voice too steady, like he was holding it all in with nails dug into his palms beneath the desk. "He needs someone real, someone who doesn't live behind shadows and guns and silence, someone good." She opened the envelope slowly, and there it was, all of it. Typed, notarized, ready. A choice, not a demand, not manipulation, just a plea disguised as formality. She looked up at him, and the mask he wore, the CEO, the kingpin, the unshakable strategist, was gone. There was only a man asking for help, not for himself, but for the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. Julia's throat closed. "You really think I'm the one who's good?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "After everything I let happen?" Enrico didn't blink. "You stayed. That's more than anyone ever did." He reached for something inside his jacket but stopped, reconsidered, and withdrew his hand, empty. "You don't have to sign it. You can walk away." "But he'll ask for you. He already does." Julia had told herself countless times that this was temporary, that when it ended she'd go back to her real life. The hospital, the city, her plans. But none of it made sense anymore without Matteo's voice in the morning. Without those tired, stubborn eyes watching her from the shadows. Without Enrico's silence beside her on the stairs. She held the pen like it was a grenade and set it down again. Her hands were shaking now. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she admitted. "Neither am I," Enrico said, "but he is." Tears came faster than she could stop them. Real ones, the kind that burned, the kind she hadn't allowed herself to cry since that night in the park, since the small hand gripped her coat and refused to let go. "You should have asked me sooner," she whispered. "I didn't know how," he said. "I don't have practice with asking." That broke her. Not the violence in his past, not the walls, but that this man who could command empires didn't know how to ask someone to stay. She signed her name before she could lose her nerve. There was a pause after the final stroke of ink. A silence so heavy it felt sacred. Then she folded the contract back into the envelope and pushed it toward him. Enrico didn't reach for it. His eyes were on her. Not possessive, not grateful, but something else entirely. Relieved. As if the world had tilted a few degrees into something survivable. She wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her shirt, half laughing through the ache in her chest. "You do realize this means I get to call you out when you're being a complete ass, right?" He actually smiled. I'd expect nothing less. Later, she stepped outside to find Matteo running barefoot across the grass, chasing a paper plane that fluttered with no direction. His laughter was louder than it had ever been. Wild, free, contagious. He spotted her and yelled, "Jules, look, it flies!" She waved at him, but her hand trembled slightly, as if the weight of everything they'd been through still clung to her bones. And yet, for the first time, there was no fear beneath it, no dread of what would come next. Matteo was safe. Enrico had made a decision, a real one, and she had chosen to be part of it, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because something inside her had changed, had grown, had healed in places she didn't know were broken. From the patio, Enrico watched as his son collapsed onto the grass, breathless with joy. Julia stepped beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "He's not afraid anymore," she said. "Neither am I," he replied. They didn't need more than that. Matteo laughed again, his voice soaring into the open sky. And for the first time, no one in that house was afraid of the monsters, because none of them lived here anymore. We pour a lot of care and heart into every story we bring to this channel, not just to tell something beautiful, but to connect with you. If this story touched you in any way, we'd love to hear what it meant to you in the comments. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting our work. You're helping us bring more of these powerful stories to life. And if you haven't seen our other videos yet, we invite you to explore them. Each one was made with you in mind. Thank you for being here with us. We truly mean that.